August 1945. The Pacific still burned in scattered embers, but in the jungles of the Philippines, the sound of war had already faded. For one small group of Japanese soldiers, silence arrived before understanding did. The air was heavy with rot and rain, a stillness more terrifying than gunfire. In the damp darkness of their caves, they had waited for orders that never came. When they finally stepped into the light, they were no longer soldiers. Gaunt faces, sunken eyes, uniforms in tatters, they emerged like ghosts from another age. In trembling hands, they carried makeshift flags of surrender, white cloth torn from their own shirts. Each step toward the clearing was an act of disbelief. They had been told Americans would kill them. They had been told surrender was shame. But what they saw, waiting beneath the trees, shattered both lessons. A U.S. transport truck stood idle, olive-drab steel, its paint dulled by rain. The men beside it wore clean uniforms, helmets tilted back, rifles lowered. The Japanese soldiers froze, their instincts caught between pride and survival. Then, slowly, hands rose. Not in salute, in fear. The Americans did not fire. They did not shout. One soldier motioned them forward with a small gesture, calm and human. The Japanese hesitated, and then obeyed. What followed was not interrogation, but water, then rice, then silence, broken only by the sound of chewing. Hunger overcame ideology in seconds. For years they had fought for an emperor they had never seen. Now they were eating from the hands of men they had been told were monsters. The bitterness of surrender mixed with the warmth of food, and something inside them began to fracture. In that jungle clearing, the war ended not with gunfire, but with a meal. Yet, for these men, the real battle, the one between memory and truth, was only beginning. Rain fell like a curtain over the American encampment, warm, relentless, and heavy with the scent of mud and oil. Beneath a canvas tent, light flickered from lanterns hung on makeshift poles. Steam rose from aluminum trays, curling into the damp air. The sound of metal ladles against tin echoed softly, rhythmic, ordinary, almost tender. For the first time in years, the prisoners heard the language of peace, the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversation, the quiet ritual of men eating together. They stood motionless at the entrance, soaked and skeletal, their eyes fixed on the table. Coffee, white bread, canned peaches, meat. Such abundance was unthinkable. It looked less like a meal, and more like a betrayal of everything they had been taught. They had been told the Americans lived without honor, that they feasted while others suffered, that their wealth was proof of corruption. And yet here, in the heart of a conquered jungle, the enemy shared food freely. An American sergeant, broad-shouldered and calm, noticed their hesitation. Without a word, he pointed to the benches. His gesture was not commanding, only patient. The prisoners exchanged glances, uncertain, ashamed. Then one man stepped forward. The rest followed, moving as if toward judgment. The first taste came slowly. Bread, soft, white, unfamiliar. Then coffee, bitter but alive. Then peaches, impossibly sweet after years of rice and roots. Each bite dismantled another layer of propaganda. The food of the enemy was not poison. It was nourishment, clean and human. Hunger, that old tyrant, silenced pride with every swallow. As the rain deepened outside, the prisoners began to look, really look, at the men across the table. They were young, tired, ordinary. No devils, no beasts, just soldiers who also wanted to go home. In that tent, between spoonfuls of borrowed mercy, the illusion of the enemy began to dissolve. But beyond the camp fence, a darker truth awaited, one that would test what this new humanity was truly worth. Before the war, every Japanese soldier had been taught a single truth: that the enemy was less than human. In training halls and classrooms, posters lined the walls depicting Americans as beasts, pale, greedy, and soulless. Pamphlets warned, "They will torture you. They will desecrate your body. Better to die than be captured." Such words had been memorized as doctrine, repeated until they became a kind of faith. To surrender was to fall into the hands of monsters. But here, in the tropical rain of the Philippines, the doctrine began to rot. The prisoners, thin and hollow-eyed, watched as American soldiers moved among them, not with cruelty, but with routine discipline. Food came first, questions later. Before the guards ate, they served the prisoners. Metal trays clattered softly, steam rose, and a strange silence fell over the camp. It was not mercy they were witnessing, it was order, efficiency, and something dangerously close to decency. When one guard noticed a prisoner struggling with his lighter, he reached out, struck a match, and lit the man's cigarette. The gesture was small, almost careless, yet it defied years of instruction. The Japanese soldier froze, unsure whether to bow or recoil. The smoke drifted between them, a fragile peace in gray air. Across the camp, the older prisoners stared in disbelief. They had expected humiliation, punishment, perhaps even execution. Instead, they received blankets. Some were given medical care. Others were allowed to write letters home. The enemy they had imagined, brutal, godless, did not exist in this place, and that realization was more disorienting than defeat itself. Ideology had promised clarity, good against evil, sacrifice against indulgence. Now the lines blurred into something unbearable. A war built on righteousness was dissolving under the weight of kindness. As night fell, a single bowl of soup steamed on a wooden table, rain dripping softly through the roof above it. Around that bowl hung a silence thicker than the jungle. For the first time, these men were forced to question not the strength of the enemy, but the truth of everything they had believed. Beyond the horizon, ships waited, vessels that would take them home. Tokyo, late 1930s. The city hums with discipline, a nation in perfect order, bound by ritual and belief. In classrooms lined with portraits of the emperor, young boys stand in rows, hands pressed to their sides, reciting words they do not yet understand, but will one day die for. Duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. Their voices rise in unison, small yet solemn, echoing through the wooden corridors like a prayer. This was the foundation of the imperial soldier, a creed that fused loyalty with divinity. The emperor was not a ruler but a living god, his will extending through every uniform, every rifle, every breath drawn by those who served him. Individual thought was unnecessary. Obedience was sacred. In a nation that prized silence over dissent, to question the emperor's purpose was to betray one's own humanity. By the mid-1930s, this faith had hardened into something unbreakable. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued decades earlier by Emperor Meiji, became the moral scripture of an empire preparing for endless war. It taught that courage lay in self-denial, that survival without victory was shame, and that surrender was the gravest sin a man could commit. From the schoolyard to the parade ground, the lesson was the same. A true soldier serves without fear, fights without question, and dies without hesitation. Beyond Japan's shores, the Western world was cast as a warning, materialistic, corrupt, soft. American democracy was ridiculed as chaos disguised as freedom, its culture proof of moral decay. While jazz and cinema filled Western streets, Japanese youth were trained in the purity of sacrifice. They learned to see comfort as weakness, compassion as vulnerability. Even food became symbolic. white rice and fish against the enemy's bread and meat. And so, when war came, these soldiers carried not just weapons but certainty. They believed themselves chosen, the final guardians of honor in a collapsing world. On the battlefields of China, Malaya, and the Philippines, they fought with a fervor born from faith, not hatred. To them, the emperor's light was eternal, and Japan's destiny unquestionable. But faith, when absolute, leaves no room for doubt and no defense against disillusionment. Years later, when those same men knelt before American soldiers offering food and mercy, the creed of their youth began to fracture. The words once recited with pride now echoed hollow in their minds. The mountain of duty had proven heavy indeed, but death, it seemed, was not as light as they were promised. In the years before the Pacific War, Japan forged not only armies of steel, but armies of spirit. Within the imperial ranks, morality itself became a weapon. War was no longer framed as conquest, it was purification. Every battle, every sacrifice, was said to cleanse the nation of softness, of the contagion of Western comfort. To live simply was virtue. To endure pain was strength. To die willingly was divine. From childhood, this creed seeped into the bloodstream of a generation. Schoolbooks praised hunger as discipline, silence as wisdom, and obedience as sacred duty. The films of the 1930s played scenes of serene heroism, soldiers smiling beneath artillery fire, mothers bowing before their sons' departure, tears hidden behind pride. Over the radio, martial songs promised that dying for the emperor was not loss, but transcendence. Against this backdrop, the Western world was painted as its opposite, indulgent, corrupt, soulless. To the imperial mind, the American soldier was a paradox, a man without spirit, corrupted by luxury, yet armed with machines of terrifying power. Propaganda stripped him of humanity. Leaflets, speeches, even military lectures described the Americans as half-human creatures, ruled by greed and lust, incapable of understanding honor. The message was clear: to fall into their hands was to fall from grace. In barracks lit by oil lamps, new recruits swore oaths not to surrender. It was said in whispers and in shouts, better to die than to shame the emperor. Officers reinforced the lesson with stories of divine soldiers who chose the bayonet or the grenade over capture. The body was mortal, but the emperor's will was eternal, and so they learned to see death as duty and life beyond defeat as corruption. Even parents bound by this creed passed it to their sons. Letters to the front often ended with quiet absolution. If captured, you are no longer ours. It was not cruelty, but faith, a belief that purity demanded extinction before compromise. The Japanese mind became a fortress, walled by fear and sanctified by myth. Yet all fortresses, no matter how divine, have cracks. Years later, in a rain-soaked camp far from home, a single act of kindness would breach those walls. A starving prisoner, once taught that mercy was impossible, lifted a spoonful of American stew to his lips. It was warm, rich, alive, and it carried no hatred. In that moment, the architecture of an empire's illusion began to tremble. But as the truth seeped in, so too did the unbearable question. If the enemy was not evil, then what had they truly been fighting for? For the Japanese soldier of the 1940s, surrender was not a tactical decision. It was the collapse of the soul. To lay down arms was to sever every thread of duty. To the emperor, to the ancestors, to the unborn generations whose honor depended on his resolve. Captivity did not mean survival. It meant moral extinction. The man who surrendered ceased to exist, not only in the eyes of his nation, but in the eyes of heaven itself. This belief was not born of cruelty, but of faith. the same faith that had held a nation together through famine, through fire, through endless war. The emperor was the living axis of existence, his soldiers bound to him by invisible cords of loyalty. Death was a return to purity, capture, a descent into shame. In the jungles of the Pacific, many carried a single bullet for themselves, or a grenade to ensure that the moment of capture would never come. And yet, for thousands, it did. The tide of the war turned, and those who once shouted, "Tenno Heika Banzai," found themselves surrounded, starving, and unarmed. Even as they were taken into custody, some still whispered prayers for death. Others plotted quiet suicides inside their bamboo enclosures, unable to reconcile breath with dishonor. But what they encountered within the American camps confounded every lesson of their lives. The guards who patrolled the wire did not strike. They gave orders, but never out of rage. Prisoners were counted, fed, and treated by military physicians. There was discipline, yes, but it was a discipline governed by rules, not revenge. To men who had been told that the Americans were beasts, this calm was more frightening than cruelty itself. One night, as rain tapped softly on the tin roof of a barracks, a prisoner asked the question that none could answer. "Why do they not beat us?" The whisper carried through the dark like a confession. Another man, once an officer, stared into the shadows and said nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than any punishment. Slowly, realization began to spread, not through lectures or propaganda, but through the quiet consistency of their captors' behavior. The enemy's strength did not lie in brutality, but in restraint. Their power came not from divine right, but from an idea that law, not hatred, could govern men. In that revelation, a fissure opened in the foundation of imperial belief. What had been unthinkable, that a nation without gods could still possess honor, was now undeniable. And as these soldiers looked beyond the barbed wire, toward a homeland still worshipping the myth of purity, they began to wonder, if surrender was truly death, why did it feel so much like awakening? The war had ended for them, but its echo remained, carried in the rattle of boots, the clang of tin trays, the drone of loudspeakers announcing order where chaos had once ruled. The prisoner of war camp stretched across the Philippine plains, a grid of neat barracks and watchtowers, ringed by barbed wire that shimmered in the tropical sun. Beyond it, the jungle sighed in the wind, ancient and indifferent. Inside, men who had once served the emperor now awoke each day to a flag that no longer inspired fear. At first, they moved through their new world like shadows, obedient, wordless, hollow. Roll call at dawn, meals at noon, silence at dusk. The rhythm of captivity was mechanical, but not cruel. American guards carried clipboards instead of whips. Rifles held not as threats, but as symbols of protocol. Everything operated according to schedule. There were forms, rules, inspections, a bureaucracy of mercy. To men shaped by an army, where emotion ruled and death was a virtue, this quiet order felt alien. The food was measured, the water rationed, the discipline firm. Yet the prisoners began to notice something unsettling. The guards kept the same discipline among themselves. They saluted superiors, addressed each other with calm respect, and corrected mistakes without shouting. Authority here was not sacred, it was procedural. For the first time, the prisoners saw a system built not on devotion, but on structure, one that functioned without faith. Days turned to weeks. Work details were assigned, repairing fences, carrying supplies, cleaning kitchens. Some learned English words in exchange for labor. Their lessons traded for cigarettes or coffee. Simple words, bread, sky, friend. At night, by dim lantern light, newspapers were passed around, the strange letters slowly deciphered. The news spoke of cities rebuilt, elections held, of a world already moving beyond the war that had consumed their youth. And then came the music. From the camp loudspeakers, between announcements and marching orders, drifted melodies unlike anything they had heard. Jazz, brass and rhythm, energy and freedom. Notes improvised, unbound by rule or hierarchy. To ears trained in the discipline of military chants, it was chaos. Yet in that chaos, something beautiful stirred. It was the sound of individuality, a quality they had been taught to suppress. Some prisoners began to hum along. Curiosity replaced fear. They watched the Americans play baseball, laugh, and argue without consequence. They saw officers corrected by their own men, not executed for disobedience. Each observation was a small crack in the armor of indoctrination. The enemy had become familiar, predictable, human. Within the camp's boundaries, something profound was happening. The prisoners, once certain of the moral inferiority of the West, began to see reflections of themselves in those they had fought. The barbed wire no longer marked the divide between civilization and barbarity. It marked the boundary between two different versions of order, one born from faith, the other from freedom. At night, as rain drummed gently on the corrugated roofs, they no longer dreamed of vengeance. They dreamed of understanding. Behind the wire, stripped of weapons and ideology, the war continued, not between nations, but within the human soul. And beyond the fence, unseen in the dark, a convoy was preparing to move them, eastward, toward an even greater revelation waiting on the shores of a ruined empire. It happened months after their capture, another meal beneath the same canvas roof. The rain had returned, steady and soft, drumming against the tent like an old memory. The American sergeant was there again, the one who had first offered food to the hollow-eyed men in the jungle. His name was Miller, a farmer from Kansas before the war. The lines on his face spoke of sun and soil, not hatred. He moved easily among the tables, his manner patient, unarmed, except for the quiet authority of routine. That morning, he spoke through a translator, a prisoner who had once been a captain in the Imperial Army. His English was hesitant, his pride more fragile than his words. The sergeant told them about his home, fields that stretched to the horizon, a wife waiting with their first child, the rhythm of wheat bending in the wind. The prisoners listened in silence, the rain filling the spaces where translation faltered. For men raised on the mythology of a decadent, soulless America, the story was disarming in its simplicity. When the food arrived, it was not rice or fish or anything familiar. It was white bread, soft, weightless, and jam, bright and red, glistening in the light like something unreal. Each man took a piece with care, as if touching something sacred. The sweetness, when it came, was overwhelming. It was not the harsh, sustaining bitterness of survival, but the softness of a life untouched by war. To men who had been taught that the enemy's indulgence was moral weakness, the taste was unbearable in its gentleness. One of the prisoners paused, staring at the jam as if it might dissolve under his gaze. He had commanded men in China, watched villages burn, believed utterly in the righteousness of his cause. Now, this small act of nourishment, given freely, without condition, felt heavier than any sermon. The sweetness lingered on his tongue like guilt. Later, in his diary, written in careful strokes on torn paper, he recorded a single line. "They feed us like men, not beasts." It was not gratitude, it was confusion, the first quiet fracture of certainty. For the soldiers of the emperor, kindness from the enemy was more corrosive than defeat. It forced them to confront a truth more painful than any wound, that humanity was not confined to one nation, one creed, one emperor. The former captain began to translate more often after that day. He asked questions, about the sergeant's farm, about the harvest, about the machines that plowed the endless American plains. He learned words like freedom, church, home. None had direct equivalents in his own tongue. Each one was a quiet rebellion against the indoctrination that had shaped his life. At night, the men spoke softly among themselves. Some wondered if this kindness was strategy, a trick to weaken them. Others, more honest, admitted that it was something purer. A few began to recall the teachings of their youth, that compassion was weakness, that mercy was a lie. But those lessons no longer felt like truth. In the flicker of the camp lanterns, surrounded by laughter that no longer seemed foreign, they understood something their empire had never taught them, that strength did not always come from sacrifice, nor purity from obedience. The taste of jam would stay with them, not as a flavor, but as a revelation. It was the sweetness of disillusionment, the quiet heresy that began to unmake an empire of belief. And far across the sea, in the ruins of Tokyo, another kind of nourishment, truth itself, was about to be forced upon a nation that had never learned to digest it. By early 1946, the rhythm of captivity had settled into something that almost resembled peace. The men rose at dawn, saluted a flag not their own, and lined up beneath the tropical sun for roll call. Their uniforms were American issue now, pale khaki replacing the frayed remnants of the rising sun. After breakfast, they worked, studied, or sat quietly in the shade, each man wrestling not with hunger or pain, but with thought, and for the first time since their surrender, they were allowed to write home. Under watchful supervision, the prisoners were handed paper, thin, official, and lined, along with dull pencils that smelled faintly of graphite and rain. They were instructed to keep their letters factual, brief, and respectful. Every line would pass through American censors before leaving the camp. Even so, the moment felt monumental. For men who had been declared dead by their own nation, it was a chance to exist again, to reach across the abyss of silence that war had carved. They began carefully. To my honored father, to my beloved mother. The words flowed slowly, awkwardly, as if testing the air. They described the camp, clean, orderly, quiet. They mentioned food, medicine, work. They avoided emotion. Some wrote that they were treated well, that the guards behaved properly. A few dared to write of kindness, but only obliquely, wrapped in understatement. They knew how these words might be read back home. To speak plainly would be to sound corrupted, to seem seduced by the enemy. Yet between the lines, another message took shape. "We are treated well" became a cipher, a confession hidden in plain sight. It meant, "They are not what we were told." It meant, "We are alive, and they have not dishonored us." To the trained eyes of the Japanese censors, these phrases were dangerous, not because they betrayed military secrets, but because they hinted at something far more subversive, the humanity of the enemy. Some letters never reached their destinations. They were intercepted in Tokyo, examined, and quietly destroyed. Officials feared what their contents implied, that compassion could undo what years of propaganda had built. To admit that American soldiers had shown mercy was to risk unraveling the spiritual foundation of the war itself. For a nation that had taught its people that capture was worse than death, mercy was not a virtue, it was poison. But a few letters slipped through. They arrived in coastal villages and city neighborhoods, carried by postmen who could not have guessed their weight. Families unfolded the pages in silence, searching for traces of shame or defiance. What they found instead were calm descriptions, restrained gratitude, and sentences that glowed faintly with contradiction. "Do not worry for me," one son wrote. "The Americans treat us like men." Another wrote, "I have learned that strength is not the same as anger." These quiet revelations, smuggled through bureaucratic paper, began to circulate in whispers. The imperial myth of the merciless foreigner, of the sacred cruelty of war, began to crumble not under bombardment, but beneath the weight of kindness. Behind the barbed wire, the prisoners had become unwilling missionaries of a new truth, that dignity could survive defeat, and that mercy, once given, could not be forgotten. The war of weapons was over, but the war of ideas had just begun. One fought not with fire, but with the fragile endurance of empathy. And soon those letters, folded, hidden, and read in secret, would return home before the men who wrote them did. Waiting there was a nation still burning, and a people about to discover that surrender did not end the war. It only changed the battlefield. The morning began like any other, humid, slow, filled with the soft clatter of tin trays in the camp mess hall. Steam rose from the rice pots, mingling with the scent of coffee and damp canvas. The war, though distant, still lived in their minds, a wound that refused to close. To the prisoners, it felt eternal, as if Japan and America had always been locked in struggle, destined to bleed against one another until both were gone. Then a murmur passed through the camp, quiet at first, uncertain. A guard, pale and unreadable, folded a newspaper beneath his arm. A few words in broken English slipped between the tables. A new bomb, a city destroyed. The men looked up, waiting for translation, but none came. In the corner, an interpreter scanned the page, his lips moving silently before his face went still. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. They say, the Americans dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. The city is gone. The mess hall fell into a silence that felt heavier than sound. For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone laughed, short, nervous, disbelieving. Another man muttered that it was a lie. American propaganda meant to humiliate them. But as the hours passed, more reports came, more whispers, more confirmation. It was not a single firebombing, not another Tokyo raid. It was something else, a light brighter than the sun, a city erased in seconds. Some prisoners wept openly, others stared at their hands, as if trying to see the bloodline of a vanished homeland. A few smiled bitterly, convinced that Japan had finally achieved its destiny, to perish gloriously rather than submit. But the truth was more complicated. They did not yet know what kind of weapon had done it, nor what it meant for the world. All they knew was that the war that had defined their lives, had reached its end not through courage or sacrifice, but through annihilation. Days later, the confirmation arrived through the camp's loudspeakers. The emperor had spoken, his voice, for the first time in history, heard by his people. It was faint, formal, almost fragile. "Endure the unendurable," he said. In that moment, the divine became human. For the men who had worshipped him as a god, the revelation was unbearable. If the emperor could surrender, then all faith, all duty, all purpose was undone. In the barracks that night, the prisoners sat in silence. Some prayed, some refused to speak at all. One man tore the insignia from his uniform and placed it carefully on the floor, whispering, "Even heaven has fallen." Another asked a guard what kind of bomb it was. The American hesitated, then answered quietly, "It was called atomic." The word meant nothing, yet it felt infinite. The guards did not celebrate. There was no shouting, no music, only bowed heads and a solemn stillness that spoke of something too immense for victory. For the Americans, the war's end had come not with triumph, but with gravity. For the Japanese, it had come with revelation, that their world of divine certainty had died in the same instant as Hiroshima. In the days that followed, the prisoners watched the sky with new eyes. The sun itself now carried a different meaning. a light that could both give life and erase it. Their belief in destiny, in purity, in eternal empire, dissolved into the soak of an invisible fire. Behind the barbed wire, among men who once prayed for death, a different silence took hold, not of defeat, but of awakening. And beyond the Pacific, in a ruined city they could not see, the world's first shadow of the atomic age still lingered, long, silent, and eternal. The monsoon had returned, warm rain falling in endless sheets, washing the dust from the camp into small rivers that wound between the barracks. The air was heavy with the scent of rust and quinine, a mixture of iron and medicine. Inside the infirmary, cots lined the walls, metal frames, thin blankets, bodies made fragile by fever. War had reduced these men to numbers, but here, in this small hut of canvas and wood, they were human again, one pulse at a time. On one of the cots lay a man who had once been a sergeant in the Imperial Japanese Army. His body was consumed by malaria. Each breath came with effort, each exhale a surrender. He had refused treatment for days. To him, being tended by an American was a final humiliation, a mercy he had been taught to despise. He whispered prayers instead, asking forgiveness for the dishonor of surviving. His fevered mind still lived in a world where the Emperor's will was absolute, where death was the only purity left to him. Then the doctor entered. He wore no rank on his sleeves, only the Red Cross stitched to his shoulder, a symbol older than the war itself. His hands were steady, his face calm, expressionless in the way of men who have seen too much. Without a word, he checked the prisoner's pulse, wiped his forehead, and began to prepare an injection. The Japanese soldier turned away, clutching the edge of the blanket. "Why?" he whispered in broken English. "Why do you help me?" The doctor paused, meeting his eyes for the first time. "Because you're alive," he said. His voice was quiet, not righteous, not heroic, simply certain. He administered the dose, checked the drip, and moved on to the next bed. There was no sermon, no explanation, no moral victory, only procedure. But to the man lying there, that simple act was incomprehensible. In his world, mercy had always been weakness, compassion a mask for deceit. Yet here was the enemy, tending him not as a soldier, not as a symbol, but as a man. Hours passed. The fever broke. When the prisoner awoke, the doctor was still there, writing notes by lantern light, his glasses fogged with humidity. Around them, other prisoners slept, men who days earlier had cursed the enemy, now resting under his care. The room felt impossibly quiet, like a chapel built not for gods, but for the living. The Japanese soldier lay awake through the night, replaying that single answer in his mind. Because you're alive. It was not ideology. It was not propaganda. It was civilization, distilled to its essence, unadorned by nation or creed. In that moment, he understood that the strength of the West did not come from its weapons or machines, but from the simple conviction that life itself had value. He had fought for an empire that taught death was sacred, that sacrifice was the highest form of devotion. But here, surrounded by the enemy, he saw another faith, one that sought not transcendence through death, but meaning through survival. It was a revelation sharper than any blade, more enduring than any victory. Weeks later, when the man regained his strength, he asked to see the doctor again, not to thank him, but to learn his name. The doctor only smiled. "Names don't matter," he said. "You just take care of the next one." That night, the former soldier sat beneath the flickering bulb of the barracks, staring at his hands. The fever had left his body, but not his conscience. He realized that the war he had fought was not between nations, but between two visions of humanity, one built on devotion, the other on dignity. In that quiet reckoning, he saw the truth that generations of warfare had obscured. Mercy, not conquest, was the ultimate weapon, and it required no army to wield it. Yet as the prisoners prepared for repatriation, none knew that returning home would test this revelation far more than captivity ever had. By autumn, the typhoon season had passed, leaving the camp drenched and still. The war was over, but inside the barbed wire, another battle had begun, one not fought with rifles or grenades, but with words. It began quietly in the barracks after dark, when the guards had finished their rounds and the prisoners lay awake on wooden bunks, staring at the tin roof that separated them from the stars. Among them, a quiet civil war was forming. The old officers, gaunt, dignified, clinging to what little remained of authority, spoke of endurance, of preserving the honor of the fallen. They quoted the rescript to soldiers, invoked the emperor's divinity, and warned that doubt was the first step toward moral decay. "We are prisoners, yes," one said, "but we are still imperial soldiers. We must not forget who we are." The younger men, those barely out of their 20s, listened in silence. They had seen Hiroshima vanish in a single flash, seen the emperor speak in a human voice, and heard American guards address them not as beasts, but as men. For them, the war had already ended in more than defeat. It had ended in revelation. One evening, a former naval cadet finally spoke. "If the Americans are devils," he asked softly, "why do they feed us?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to extinguish. The officers bristled. "Because they want to weaken us, to turn us into them," one replied, but his voice faltered. The answer no longer satisfied even himself. For years they had lived within a moral fortress, protected by myth and faith. Now that fortress was collapsing from within. Each act of kindness from their captors chipped away at its walls. The debates grew louder as nights grew longer. "If the emperor is divine," another prisoner asked, "why did he surrender?" No one could answer. The question was heresy, yet it burned through the silence with the clarity of truth. They argued about everything, about loyalty, shame, survival, the meaning of Japan itself. To some, the war had been a holy crusade betrayed by weak leadership. To others, it had been madness disguised as duty. One man, once a field instructor, known for his sermons on the nobility of death, now spent his days teaching English phrases to younger prisoners. "Thank you, good morning, friend." Words that once symbolized the enemy had become keys to understanding a new world. When another officer confronted him, "Have you forgotten who you are?" he replied quietly, "No, I am learning who I was never allowed to be." These nightly arguments became the true reconstruction of Japan, born not in the Diet of Tokyo, but in the huts of captivity, where men stripped of power began to rebuild their minds. What had begun as defeat slowly transformed into inquiry. What had been shame began to look like survival. The Americans, watching from the perimeter, said nothing. They understood what was happening. Behind the fences, an empire was dying, but something else, fragile and human, was being born in its place. By the time orders for repatriation arrived, the debates had ceased, not because they were resolved, but because words no longer seemed enough. The prisoners lined up for inspection, thinner, quieter, older. The same men who once believed that death was their only honor now looked toward the horizon with cautious curiosity. For the first time, defeat did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, a slow, painful rebirth, forged not through conquest, but through understanding. And as the ships prepared to take them home, one of the younger men wrote in his journal, We came here as soldiers. We leave as men. Beyond the camp gates, Japan waited, shattered, occupied, and alive. Its next war would not be fought with weapons, but with ideas, and it had already begun in the silence between those who once called each other enemies. The gates opened in the spring of 1946. No fanfare, no ceremony, only the creak of hinges, the soft rustle of uniforms, and the quiet shuffle of men who had forgotten how to walk without formation. They were thinner now, older in the eyes, yet calmer than when they had arrived. Each was handed a bundle of new clothes, a ration of food, and a handshake. The war was long over. Their captivity was not. American officers lined the pathway to the trucks, offering cigarettes and nods of acknowledgement. There was no triumph in their faces, only a kind of mutual fatigue, a shared understanding that no one had truly won anything. For many of the prisoners, the touch of the American's hand was the last act of mercy they would know for years. It was warm, firm, human. Some bowed in return, others turned away, unable to speak through the ache in their throats. They boarded the ships at dawn. The sea stretched out in pale silence, endless and grey, like a mirror to the past. On deck, men stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the horizon where their homeland waited. Freedom, at last, tasted strange, not sweet, but uncertain. They were free men, yes, but haunted by kindness, bound forever to the memory of those who had fed them, healed them, and treated them not as enemies, but as equals. Japan emerged slowly from the mist. What they saw broke them anew. The cities were flattened. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagasaki, seas of rubble and twisted steel. Smoke still curled from the ruins of what had once been belief. The emperor, the man once worshipped as divine, now spoke as a human being on American radio. His words were soft. His divinity dissolved into apology. The gods of empire had fallen silent. In their place stood hunger, ash, and silence. When the returning prisoners stepped ashore, there were no parades, no cheers. Families met them with tears and restraint. Some turned away. Others whispered, "You lived among the enemy." To have surrendered was shame enough. To have survived under American care was betrayal. Many former POWs avoided their neighbors, carrying an invisible burden heavier than captivity itself. The empire that had once glorified death now had no place for those who had chosen life. Yet among them, something enduring had changed. The men who had seen the enemy's humanity could not unsee it. They had lived inside the contradiction, that compassion could exist within conquest, that moral strength could arise from restraint. They had watched their enemy live by rules and realized that civilization was not measured by purity, but by mercy. Some of these men would become teachers, translators, doctors, bridges between two worlds that had once sought each other's destruction. They carried with them a quiet strength, the kind that comes from understanding rather than victory. In letters, diaries, and interviews years later, many would recall not the battles they fought, but the meals they were given. "We tasted the enemy's kindness," one wrote. "It changed everything." In the story of the Pacific War, their experience rarely appeared in textbooks. It lacked the glory of conquest, the spectacle of defeat, but it contained something deeper, a truth that history often overlooks, that humanity can survive even when nations cannot. For in a mess hall half a world away, among trays of white bread and jam, a generation of soldiers discovered the simplest weapon of all, compassion, and though their homeland was in ruins, they would return carrying something indestructible, the knowledge that mercy, once felt, cannot be erased. Beyond the docks, a new Japan was stirring, occupied, humbled yet alive. Its rebirth would not come from its armies or its emperors, but from the men who had once eaten at the tables of their enemies and learned that civilization was not inherited, it was chosen. In 1946, the land that had once sworn to die rather than yield began to rebuild, not through conquest, but through cooperation. Under the watchful eyes of American occupation, Japan entered an age that few could have imagined. Democracy by decree, peace enforced by the victors, and a new national purpose emerging from the ruins. Cities once consumed by fire now stirred with the sounds of hammers and voices, rebuilding not temples to empire, but schools, factories, and homes. For millions, defeat was humiliation, but for some, especially those who had lived behind the wire, it was revelation. Among the returning prisoners of war, a quiet minority carried an unusual strength, not faith in the old Japan, but understanding of the new. They had seen their captors' discipline, their restraint, their belief in rules instead of gods. Many of them, once soldiers sworn to die for the emperor, now found themselves working for the general headquarters of the Allied occupation. They became translators, educators, and reformers, bridging two worlds that had only ever known each other through blood. Their memories of captivity returned often, not the beatings or hunger, but the moments of decency that had felt impossible. They remembered the first American meal, the bread, the coffee, the jam. It had not been luxury that changed them, but the meaning behind it. That nourishment could be an act of peace. In a world rebuilding from ashes, that single truth became their quiet creed. As Japan's new constitution took shape, words like freedom, rights, and humanity found their way into law for the first time. Former soldiers who once worshipped hierarchy now taught civics in newly opened classrooms. They told their students that honor did not come from obedience, but from conscience. In community centers and local councils, they spoke softly of what they had learned in foreign camps, that kindness could survive war, and that dignity could exist even in defeat. The Americans, too, had learned a lesson. They understood that rebuilding a nation required more than roads and treaties. It required feeding the spirit. Through the 1940s and 1950s, ships arrived in Tokyo Bay not with tanks, but with grain, wheat, milk, sugar, and flour. The same food, once shared between captor and captive, became instruments of diplomacy. School lunch programs began under American guidance, teaching children not just nutrition, but trust. For the first time, a generation of Japanese children tasted bread and milk as symbols not of occupation, but of renewal. It was, in its way, the continuation of the same lesson learned in that prison mess hall years earlier, that food could carry more power than ideology, that compassion could succeed where armies failed. What had once shattered faith now nourished a new one. Across the country, a moral inversion was taking place. Surrender, once synonymous with shame, was being reimagined as wisdom. To yield was no longer to perish. It was to adapt, to evolve, to endure. In government offices, in newspapers, and in the slow rebuilding of civic life, this transformation deepened. The old symbols of militarism were dismantled. The war dead were mourned not as martyrs, but as victims of delusion. And through it all, the memory of mercy, small, human, and unspoken, became the quiet cornerstone of the nation's rebirth. Japan's new peace was not born of divine revelation or political genius. It was born of something simpler, the recognition that strength without empathy leads only to ruin. In the years to come, the same men who once swore never to surrender would teach their children that peace was not weakness, but the highest form of courage. The empire had fallen, but from its ashes rose something far greater, a nation built not on fear, but on understanding. And far across the ocean, in the heartland of America, the farmer's son who once served bread to his enemies would open a newspaper and see a photograph of Japan, rebuilt, free and alive. He would not smile in pride, but in quiet remembrance, because sometimes history's greatest victories begin not with a weapon, but with a meal. Decades passed. The war receded into photographs and monuments, into the silence of memorial stones, and the soft whir of reels in black and white documentaries. Yet for the men who had lived it, its echo never faded. It returned not in nightmares or in glory, but in moments of stillness, a taste, a smell, a sound that called them back to the day the world they knew had died, and something better had quietly begun. In the late 1960s, one such man, a former prisoner from the Philippine camp, arrived in the United States as part of a cultural exchange. He was gray-haired now, a professor of ethics at a Tokyo university. He had lived long enough to see his country reborn, its skyline filled with light and glass, its children nourished by the very foods that once came from their conquerors. Yet he carried within him the unhealed memory of hunger and the strange mercy that had once ended it. One afternoon, in a small grocery store in Kansas, he stopped before a shelf stacked with familiar tins, peaches in syrup, the same brand he had seen steaming in aluminum trays 25 years earlier. For a long while he said nothing. The store owner, puzzled by his stillness, asked if he needed help. The old man only smiled faintly. "No," he said, "I have found what I came for." That evening, speaking at a nearby college, he faced a room of young Americans, children of the generation that had fought his own. They listened politely, curious but detached, the war to them a story in black and white. During the question period, a student raised his hand. "Did you hate us?" he asked. The professor's answer came slowly. "Once," he said, "until they fed me." He told them of the jungle, of surrender, of a meal that had undone years of fear. He spoke of the sergeant from Kansas who had ladled food into the bowls of starving enemies without hesitation, and of how that act had reshaped an empire's belief about itself. "They defeated us," he said, "not with bombs, but with bread." When the lecture ended, no one moved for several seconds. The students sat in quiet astonishment, sensing that the lesson they had heard was not about war, but about civilization, the invisible strength that chooses compassion over conquest. History often records victory in treaties and surrenders, in parades and signatures. But the truer victory is smaller, almost invisible. It is the moment when hatred collapses under the weight of understanding, when a meal given in kindness rewrites what centuries of violence have taught. Empires rise on steel and ambition. They fall by the same means, but mercy endures. It travels through generations in the simplest forms: a word, a gesture, a spoonful of food shared between enemies. The narrator's voice fades over a final image, a mess tent in the rain, steam rising from trays of peaches and bread, trembling hands reaching forward. The scene is quiet, almost sacred. They built their armies to win battles, but they won the future with a meal.